Years passed since I've last seen my dad. I was born and raised in Nottingham, but he was from way up in Fort Augustus. My mum watched me pack my bag for the weekend and reminded me not to expect to get through my father's obsession. She never kept me from him as a child, but seemed to be more cautious of me as an adult. But I needed to see him. I was 19 now, and I sometimes saw things in myself that were entirely from him, and not good things. I needed to know why he became so obsessed with this thing, why he gave up everything, why he gave up us. The road stretched ahead in shifting shades of quiet, swallowed by fog so thick it blurred the line between earth and sky. My headlights barely cut through it, illuminating only the wet asphalt and the skeletal outline of trees lining the narrow road. Somewhere in the distance, Loch Ness lay beyond the mist, a dark presence at my side. I hadn't seen it yet, but I knew it was there, like a ghost waiting to make itself known. The drive from Nottingham was long, but my thoughts made it longer. I hadn't seen my father in years, and I hadn't missed him much either. Growing up, he'd been a voice over the phone, a name scrawled on Christmas cards, an occasional visit that always felt like a business transaction. Here's some money, here's a souvenir, a t-shirt, here's a promise to call more often that I won't keep. And now, here I was, returning to the place I barely remembered, looking for answers I wasn't sure I wanted. The sign for Fort Augustus appeared out of the fog, battered by weather and time. As I turned off the main road, memories tugged at the edges of my mind. The smell of damp wood, the creak of the docks, the endless stories about a monster lurking beneath the water. My father's obsession defined him, shaped his life, driven him to build a business around chasing shadows. Now that same obsession brought me back, though for different reasons. I pulled up to the dockside, where my father's boat tour company still clung to life. Brodie's lock tours had seen better days. The paint on the sign was peeling, the wooden shack that served as an office leaned slightly to one side, and the boat itself, a small, aging vessel moored at the dock, looked like it had weathered one storm too many. And then I saw him. Malcolm Brodie stood on the dock, hands shoved into his worn-out jacket, looking exactly as I remembered, but older, rougher. His dark hair had gone mostly grey, and the lines on his face deepened. He wasn't a big man, but he had a presence, like the water itself, quiet, but never quite still. When he saw me, he gave a slow nod, as if I were a regular customer arriving for a tour. "Finley," he said, my full name rolling off his tongue like I was still a kid. "Dad," I replied. That was all. No hug, no handshake, just the acknowledgement that we were both here, standing on the same patch of wood, breathing the same cold, damp air. Before I could say anything else, another voice cut in. "You must be Finn." I turned, and there he was, Lachlan Reed. He was my age, maybe a little younger, with dark auburn hair and sharp green eyes that took me in like he was sizing me up. He had the kind of easy confidence that people like me found infuriating. His jacket was scuffed, his boots were worn, and yet he stood there like he owned the place, like he belonged here. And I hated that. "Lachlan," my father said, nodding toward him. "He's been helping out." It was clear he knew the ins and outs of the boat, the business, everything. I hadn't been here in years, and already I was the outsider. "Nice to meet you," Lachlan said, offering his hand. I shook it out of politeness, ignoring the way his grip was firm, steady. He smirked slightly, like he knew exactly what I was thinking. Inside, the office smelled like damp paper and old wood. The small heater in the corner hummed, barely making a dent in the cold. My father sat behind his desk, while Lachlan leaned against the counter, too comfortable, too at home. Over dinner, my father did what he always did, talked about crazy stories, about the water levels, the changing currents, the tourists who still came hoping to catch a glimpse of something impossible. Lachlan, however, was different. He didn't just listen, he believed. "There's been something strange happening out there," Lachlan said, setting his fork down. His voice was eager, his eyes bright. Last week we lost a sonar buoy. No warning, no sign of damage. Just gone. And yesterday, I picked up something big moving under the boat. Bigger than anything that should be in these waters. I scoffed before I could stop myself. Right. Because it couldn't possibly be a malfunction or, I don't know, a big fish. Lachlan turned his gaze to me, his smirk returning. You always this fun at dinner? My father chuckled, the sound low and amused. You sound like your mum. That struck a nerve, but I let it slide. I just think it's ridiculous how people keep convincing themselves there's something out there. Lachlan didn't look offended. If anything, he looked intrigued. You don't believe in anything, do you? I met his gaze, refusing to back down. I believe in things that make sense. Shame, he said, picking up his fork again. The world's more interesting when you let yourself wonder. Tension crackled between us, silent but heavy. My father, oblivious or ignoring it, kept talking about his theories, but I wasn't really listening anymore, because Lachlan Reed was already under my skin, and I hated that even more. Sleep didn't come easy. I lay awake in the small, musty room my father set up for me, staring at the ceiling while the sound of water lapping against the dock pressed from outside. The occasional creak of the boat shifting, the wind stirring the trees. I told myself that was all it was. But the longer I listened, the more I noticed something else. A low, resonant sound beneath the surface. Not the ripple of a wave or the groan of wood against water, but something deeper. A vibration that hummed through my bones, impossibly distant, and yet close enough to feel. I pushed the covers back, stepping into the cold. The floorboards protested under my weight as I moved to the door and slipped outside. The fog thickened, turning the world into a dim, shifting blur. The dock stretched ahead, disappearing into the mist. Beyond it, the water was invisible, but its presence was undeniable, a dark, waiting thing. I stood at the edge, hands shoved into my pockets, listening. The sound came again, so low I might have imagined it. You heard it, didn't you? I nearly jumped. Lachlan stood a few feet away, leaning against one of the wooden posts, arms crossed over his chest. His hair was ruffled, his jacket half zipped like he hadn't planned on sleeping either. The fog made his edges blur, but his eyes, sharp and bright even in the dim light, were locked onto me. Heard what? I asked, schooling my expression into something neutral. He tilted his head slightly, watching me like he could see right through the lie. You wouldn't be out here if you didn't hear something. I turned back to the water. It was probably nothing. This place makes people hear things that aren't there. Lachlan let out a quiet huff of amusement. You know, for someone who doesn't believe in anything, you seem awfully concerned about proving yourself right. I clenched my jaw but didn't respond. He stepped closer, the dock creaking under his weight. I've been tracking those sounds for months. They're not big fish, not boats, not underwater landslides. They're something else. I glanced at him. And let me guess, you think it's Nessie? He didn't flinch at the skepticism in my voice. I think it's something. I don't care if it fits the old stories or not. The water is too deep, too unexplored for us to pretend we know everything in it. He studied me for a moment, then added, You should come see our setup tomorrow. I shook my head. I didn't come here for fairy tales. His expression shifted, something between amusement and frustration. Suit yourself. He turned back toward the shack. See you in the morning, Finley. I watched him disappear into the mist. The next morning, my father and Lachlan left early to take the boat out. I stayed behind. The office was a disaster. Papers scattered across the desk, old maps curling at the edges, tangled cables shoved into corners. My father was never organised, but the sight of it made my skin itch. So I did what I always did when things felt out of control. I started fixing. I stacked every loose sheet into perfect piles, sorted maps by age and accuracy, untangled every cord, and looped them neatly. The work settled something in me, forced the thoughts out of my head. The need to fix consumed everything else, turning the room into something logical, something I could control. When the door swung open, I didn't look up. You know, some of us like being able to find things, Lachlan's voice said, teasing but edged with something else. I placed the last map down and finally turned. Mal stepped inside first, shaking off his coat, but Lachlan stood behind him, energy thrumming under his skin. His eyes were bright, his hands moving as he spoke. "You should have come with us," he said. "We picked up something big today, bigger than anything I've ever heard before." I leaned back against the desk, unimpressed. "Let me guess. You discovered something no scientist ever has. All in a day's work, right?" He exhaled sharply, raking a hand through his hair. "You're exhausting." Mal, oblivious or choosing to ignore the tension, clapped a hand on Lachlan's shoulder. "Go on, play it for him." Lachlan grabbed his laptop, set it on the desk, and clicked a few buttons. And then I heard it. A deep, reverberating sound filled the office, low and vast and wrong. It wasn't a trick of the water or an engine or anything else easily explained. It was alive, shifting in tone like it was moving through the depths. The sound changed the same way an ambulance siren would as it blared past you. I felt it in my ribs, in my teeth. It was the same sound that got me out of bed the night before. Then something deep in me, a hidden voice, reminded me of when I was 6. It was the same sound from when... And I noticed Lachlan was watching me closely. "Well?" he asked. I forced a shrug. "Could be anything." Frustration flickered across his face. "You're telling me that sounds normal to you?" "It sounds like a noise in the water," I said, forcing my voice to stay even. "And I'm not a noise in the water expert." He scoffed, running a hand over his face. "You're impossible." I woke in the dark, my body on edge before my mind caught up. Something pulled me from sleep, something outside. I held my breath, listening. The usual night sounds were there, the rustling of wind through trees, the distant hoot of an owl. But beneath it all is something else, a deep slosh of water, the creak of the dock shifting, not from the wind, but from weight. I sat up, swinging my legs over the side of the bed. My pulse hammered in my throat. It's nothing. Water moves, wood expands, fish splash. But another noise came, low, deliberate, like something dragging against the shore. I stood, crossing to the window. The fog was so thick it swallowed everything beyond the shack's porch. I could make out the dock, slick with mist, empty. Then, another sound, a wet, heavy shift. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside, the cold, damp air swallowing me whole. The boards creaked under my feet as I inched forward, squinting into the dark. Nothing. The water was invisible beyond the mist, a black, silent void. I stood there for a long time, cold, waiting. But the sounds didn't come back. Morning brought no clarity. Lachlan stormed into the shack before I'd even finished my tea, shoving damp hair from his face. One of the sonar devices is gone. Mal, pouring himself coffee, frowned. "Gone?" "I mean gone," Lachlan snapped, throwing his hands up. "We anchored it last night. I checked the coordinates. It's not there." Mal hummed, unconcerned. "Could have drifted." Lachlan shot me a look. "Or something took it." I let out a sharp breath. "Jesus, you act like the loch is full of sea monsters." He turned to me, eyes flashing. "Right, because that would be ridiculous. It's much more likely that a perfectly stable, 100-pound piece of equipment just vanished in the night." I scoffed. "You're obsessed." Lachlan stepped closer. "And you're in denial." "About what?" He gestured vaguely toward the water. "You hear things. You feel it. But instead of admitting something weird is happening, you'd rather pretend everything is perfectly normal." I don't need to indulge in fairy tales just because. Because what? His voice dropped, razor sharp. Because it doesn't fit into your tidy little world. Because it makes you uncomfortable. Something hot twisted in my chest. Lachlan didn't stop. You're so desperate to distance yourself from your father that you'd rather be miserable than admit he might not be entirely wrong. The words hit harder than they should have. I clenched my jaw. Says the guy who's playing first mate to a man who barely knows him. Lachlan flinched. For a second, I thought I'd won. But then he let out a breath and shook his head, stepping back. Forget it, he said, turning on his heel. I did try to forget it. But later, Lachlan sat hunched over his laptop, scrolling through the day's footage. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers tapped against the desk. He was pissed, and I hated that I cared. I was halfway to the door when he suddenly said, "Finn." I hesitated. What? He didn't look up, just rewound something on the screen. Come here. I sighed, stepping closer. On the monitor, grainy footage played from one of the underwater cameras. At first it was nothing, only murky blackness, the occasional flicker of light catching on drifting silt. Then, for the briefest second, something passed through the frame. Something huge. A shadow, blurred by the water, but unmistakably moving. It was gone in the blink of an eye. I stared at the screen, my throat dry. Lachlan rewound it, played it again, and again. Could be a trick of the light, I said, forcing the words out. Lachlan exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. You don't even believe yourself. He was right. I didn't. That evening, the fog was thick enough to erase the world. I sat outside, arms crossed against the cold, staring out at the water. Lachlan sat beside me, legs stretched out, hands shoved into his jacket pockets. Neither of us spoke for a long time. The silence wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't hostile either. Just there, filling the space between us. The water was too still, the air too heavy. Lachlan exhaled. You ever get the feeling this place is watching? I swallowed. I didn't want to agree. But instead of snapping at him, instead of shutting him out, I let myself say, quietly, honestly, yeah. Lachlan didn't gloat, didn't smirk or throw it back in my face. He nodded. The loch stretched out before us, black and endless. The mist curled low over the water, thick enough to blur the horizon. Lachlan shifted beside me, rubbing his hands together for warmth. I saw something once, he said, voice quiet. I glanced at him. What? He stared at the water, his jaw tight. Not a shadow, not a log, not some trick of the light. Something alive. When? I said. Years ago. I was a kid, visiting family in Drumnadrochit. My uncle took me out on his boat one morning, real early, before the tours started. The water was still, quiet. His fingers curled against his knee. Then, out of nowhere, the water moved. Not like a wave. More like something shifting underneath. I didn't say anything, but my hands clenched into fists. Lachlan exhaled, shaking his head. I only saw it for a second. A shape beneath the surface, dark and massive. It wasn't a fish. It wasn't a seal. It was something else. He finally looked at me, his eyes sharp. After that, I couldn't stop thinking about it, about what it meant. He let out a breathless laugh. So yeah, that's why I'm here. That's why I put up with Mal and his stubborn, grumpy son. I scoffed, but there wasn't any real heat behind it. I wanted to tell him he was imagining things, that it was nothing more than a big fish, a rogue current, a tired kid making sense of the world the way kids do. But my throat felt tight, because I knew that look in his eyes. I knew what it was like to see something and never be able to let it go. I should have said nothing. I should have let it sit. But before I could stop myself, the words came tumbling out. When I was 6, I fell in. Lachlan blinked. What? My dad. I hesitated. Mal, he was drunk, passed out in the boat. I don't even remember how it happened. 1 second, I was holding on to the side, looking down at the water. The next, I was in it. The memory came back sharp, vivid, the shock of the cold, the weight of my clothes dragging me under, the burn in my lungs. I should have drowned, I admitted. I remember sinking, the water closing over my head. Mal wasn't waking up. No one was coming. Lachlan was completely still. But then, I wasn't sinking anymore. I swallowed hard. I don't remember how. I don't remember what happened. 1 second, I was going under. The next, I was floating, like something was holding me up. His breath hitched. I don't know how I made it back into the boat, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what pulled me up. I forced out a laugh, but it sounded thin. I've never told anyone that, not even Mal. Lachlan didn't speak right away. He stared at me, something unreadable in his expression. Then, slowly, he reached out and placed his hand over mine. His palm was warm, grounding. I hadn't even realized I was shaking. We sat like that, silent, our breath curling into the cold air. Then, a sound. Low, deep, a vibration that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The dock trembled beneath us. Lachlan's fingers tightened around mine. The water rippled, the water shifting in unnatural patterns. But there was nothing there. No movement. No wind. We held our breath, listening, and the loch listened back. I packed my bag before the sun fully rose, shoving clothes into my duffel with more force than necessary. The air inside the office felt stifling, the weight of the past few days pressing in from all sides. I'd let myself get dragged into this, into him, and I needed to cut myself loose before I lost sight of why I came here in the first place. Lachlan was still asleep in the back room, oblivious to the fact that I was leaving. Good. I slung the bag over my shoulder and stepped outside, the morning mist curling around me. Everything was quiet, as if the water itself was holding its breath. Mal was waiting by the dock. I hesitated, grip tightening around the strap of my bag. I'd planned on slipping away without a word, but the way he stood there, arms crossed, staring out at the water, it stopped me. "Thought you'd be gone by now," he said without looking at me. I sighed. "I am." Mal nodded, slow and deliberate. For a moment, I thought that was it, that he'd let me go without a fight. But then he spoke, quieter than I'd ever heard him. "You need to see this." I almost laughed. "Mal." He turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "Get in the boat." Something in his voice, something different, made my pulse stutter. I should have said no, should have walked past him and kept going. Instead, I set my bag down. The boat rocked beneath us as Mal steered us away from the dock, the mist swallowing the shoreline. The world shrank to only the two of us, and the water stretching endlessly in every direction. Neither of us spoke. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to shake the gnawing sense of unease settling deep in my chest. I didn't know where we were going. I didn't know why we were going. And then Mal cut the engine. The silence was absolute. The water stretched, flat and dark as a void. No wind, no ripples. Mal exhaled through his nose. Then slowly he raised a hand and pointed. I followed his gaze. At first there was nothing, only water, the same endless black I'd seen 1,000 times before. But then it moved, a shadow beneath the surface, long, massive. It slid through the water with slow, deliberate ease, shifting the surface enough to send a rolling swell toward the boat. My breath caught in my throat. It was too big, too smooth. Not a fish, not a log, not some stray wave, something ancient, something alive. The swell grew, lifting the boat ever so slightly, and then, right ahead of us, the water broke. A shape rose, dark against the fog, sleek and glistening. It wasn't the full body, only a ridge of something, something impossibly large. I gripped the side of the boat so hard my knuckles ached. I could hear my heartbeat, a frantic drum in my ears. And then, as slowly as it appeared, it sank beneath the surface. The water stilled. The mist curled back into place. It was gone. I turned to Mal, my chest rising and falling in sharp, uneven breaths. He was still watching the spot where it had been, his expression unreadable, and all he did was sigh. "No one else needs to know," he said. His voice was steady, certain. I stared at him, my pulse still thundering. "You're serious?" He met my eyes. "Aye. But what about Lachlan? He needs to see. He deserves to see." "And he has," Mal said. "At first we found it 2 summers ago. Well, truth be told, she found us. And she hasn't been shy with us since." I swallowed hard, glancing back at the water, at the empty space where something had been, something real. I should have argued, should have told him he was insane, that this was proof, that it would change everything. But I didn't, because I understood. Some things weren't meant to be shared. Some things were meant to be kept. And as we drifted there, the mist swallowing us whole, I realized this was one of them. Back on land, the world felt too solid beneath my feet, like I'd spent too long floating and forgot how to stand. The water stretched behind me, silent and unmoved, as if it hadn't swallowed my entire understanding of reality. Mal climbed onto the dock ahead of me, shaking water from his sleeves. He didn't say anything, didn't look at me, just walked toward the office with the slow, measured steps of someone carrying something heavy. I followed. Inside, the place was dim and still. The scent of damp wood and old paper filled the air. Mal leaned against the counter, rubbing a hand over his stubbled jaw. For the first time since I got here, he looked tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep could fix. Something deeper, something that settled into his bones. I crossed my arms. "So, that's it?" He let out a breath, shaking his head. "Aye." I waited for more, some kind of explanation, but none came, and I realized there wasn't an explanation, not one that would make sense. He glanced at me, eyes sharp, but not unkind. "You're thinking too much." I huffed a dry laugh. "That's what I do." Mal considered me for a moment. "Aye," he said again, but this time there was something almost amused in his voice. "I know." Silence settled between us, not uncomfortable, but weighty, like neither of us knew how to step out of whatever happened on that boat. Then, finally, Mal exhaled. "Listen, I don't have the answers, Finn." His voice was quieter now, stripped of its usual stubborn certainty. "Not for this. Not for you." I looked away. He ran a hand through his hair. "But if you're anything like me, and you are, whether you like it or not, you'll tear yourself apart looking for something that might not even be there." He paused. "And I don't want that for you." I swallowed hard. "So what do you want?" Mal sighed. "I want you to stop running long enough to figure out where you actually want to go." I didn't answer right away. I wasn't sure how. Because I had been running. Away from him. From this place. From the parts of myself I didn't want to look at too closely. And maybe it was time to stop. I surprised myself when I spoke. "I'm staying." Mal blinked. "What?" "Not forever," I said quickly. "But for now. Long enough to—" I hesitated, then shrugged. "I don't know. Long enough to figure things out." For a second he stared at me. Then slowly he nodded. "All right." And that was it. No lecture, no dramatics. Just all right. I stepped outside before I could change my mind, before I could overthink it the way I did everything else. The fog thinned, the sky shifting from grey to the soft blue of late morning. I found myself at the dock, hands in my pockets, staring out at the water. I wasn't sure how long I stood there before Lachlan's voice cut through the quiet. "Guess you won't be calling me crazy anymore." I turned. He stood a few feet away, arms crossed, smirking like he'd won. I rolled my eyes. Don't push your luck. Lachlan chuckled, stepping closer. You're staying then? I nodded, more certain this time. Yeah. His smirk softened into something else, something I couldn't quite name. Good. A beat of silence. The water lapped gently against the dock. Then, before I could think about it too much, I said, You want to grab a drink? Lachlan's brows shot up, like he hadn't expected that. Then, slowly, he grinned. About time. He fell into step beside me as we walked toward town, the loch stretching behind us, vast and unreadable. I didn't need to look back to know it was still there, holding its secrets. Some things, I realized, weren't meant to be explained. Some things were meant to be felt